Hello and welcome back to Straightforward, Levant TV's political debate show. In the early morning of March 26, Saudi Arabia went to war against the Houthi rebels in Yemen. In doing so, Saudi leaders opened the latest chapter in a long history of meddling and influence over their southern neighbor. This time, the stakes are higher for both Saudi Arabia and Yemen. The Saudis and their Gulf Arab allies went to restore Yemeni President Abd-Rabbu Mansour Hadi to power. So how would that be achieved? And what is the role of other regional and global powers, including Iran, Russia and the United States? Let me first welcome our guest here at the studio, journalist and deputy editor of 5 Pillars, Dilly Hussain. Welcome on Straightforward.
Thank you for having me on.
Before we get into our discussion, let's have a look at this brief report.
The UN Security Council imposed an arms embargo targeting the Iran-allied Houthi rebels, who now control most of Yemen, as battles in the south of the country intensified. The Security Council also imposed a global asset freeze and travel ban on Ahmed Saleh, the former head of Yemen's Republican Guard, and on Houthi leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi. Egypt said it and Saudi Arabia had discussed holding a major military maneuver in Saudi Arabia with other Gulf states, following talks on the progress of the 3-week-old Saudi-led campaign of airstrikes against the Houthis in Yemen. The UN resolution also demanded the Houthis stop fighting and withdraw from areas they have seized, including the capital Sana'a and the southern port city of Aden. On the ground, southern militiamen claimed gains against the Houthis on several battlefronts across southern Yemen, including districts of Aden, the last stronghold of loyalists to Saudi-backed President Abd-Rabbu Mansour Hadi. Iran, who Saudi has accused of arming the Houthis, has called for an end to Saudi-led airstrikes. Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif has proposed a ceasefire followed by humanitarian assistance and dialogue between the warring factions inside Yemen.
It's not a negotiation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran and Saudi Arabia need to talk. But we cannot talk to determine the future of Yemen. This is an intra-Yemeni dialogue. Yemenis have to speak to themselves. Everybody else has to facilitate.
The conflict, though rooted in local rivalries, has been labelled a proxy battlefield for Sunni-ruled Saudi and mainly Shiite Iran.
Dilly Hussain, let's get to the point, to the core of your arguments. Published recently, you believe journalists have rushed to paint the current Saudi-led intervention in Yemen through a sectarian lens. You argue that geopolitical dimensions of the conflict are far more significant. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, so as soon as Saudi Arabia announced that they will be carrying out airstrikes along with other GCC states, majority of the mainstream news outlets, even in the West, referred to them as Sunni Arab states. And immediately what you saw was a certain sectarian line where the intervention was being covered from. But realistically, what the intervention is really about is a geopolitical Cold War that has been taking place between Saudi Arabia and Iran for the best part of 20-25 years. And this is the angle or perspective that's sort of being ignored. Rather, what we're seeing is a strong emphasis on the whole sectarian rhetoric of it. And the reason why that is to, generally speaking, especially within the Middle East, sectarian rhetoric and narrative works. In many cases, it fools the masses, it rallies the masses behind the cause. But in reality, what it is, it's the new king of Saudi Arabia flexing his muscles at the possibility of a stronger Iran in the region.
And now let's have a look at Oman, from where we are joined by Dr. Elisabeth Kendall, Senior Research Fellow in Islamic Studies at Pembroke College at the University of Oxford. Welcome to Straightforward Levant TV.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Dr. Kendall, tell us about Yemen and why and what do you believe is a dangerous spillover from the west to the east in Yemen, and how dangerous and in what sense exactly?
Well, I think it's easy for us to focus on the main frames of play, which are, of course, the capital Sana'a and also Aden, the former capital of South Yemen, and to focus so much attention on that we don't think about how this kind of conflict might play out 1,000 kilometers to the east. This is the area where I work. It's a largely desert tribal area, and it borders Oman, Saudi Arabia, and of course has a maritime border to Somalia. So even that geographical description would tell you why this is of geopolitical importance, this particular area. Now, this kind of environment stands to have vested interests who can make considerable profit out of a war situation. And that can happen in many ways. Smuggling weapons and other illegal substances, drugs, smuggling of drugs is quite rife in this area. But also as a safe haven for Al-Qaeda, for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. We've seen increasing incursions by Al-Qaeda into these eastern desert areas, east of Hadramaut, over the last couple of years. I think it's complacent to imagine that life will carry on as normal in these areas when we have an increasing humanitarian disaster and volatile war zone in the west of Yemen. In fact, we're already seeing signs of the conflict spilling over into these deserts.
And now Oman's voiced an initiative to mediate in Yemen's crisis through its foreign minister, Yusuf bin Alawi. Now, why was it Muscat this time? I know it's a bordering state, but why Muscat, not a bigger state, maybe like Abu Dhabi or any other Gulf country that has a bigger say usually?
Well, Oman is ideally placed to mediate a settlement because, not just as you mentioned, because it borders Yemen, but because it has always maintained a neutral stance. It's very careful to protect its neutrality in regional disputes. With regards to Yemen, that's particularly important because although Oman has a majority Sunni population, it also has open lines of communication to Iran. And as you will understand, these are the two sides of the so-called proxy war that have been built up in the media and look like they're becoming an increasing reality. So Oman can play that mediating role.
And Dr. Kendall, so what's the end game there when it comes to this? And how would regional players want it to be, particularly Saudi Arabia?
Well, that's a difficult question. The end game, as it's been stated by those involved in the military campaign led by Saudi Arabia, has many different components, some of them even conflicting. But it looks like the most obvious desired outcome is to bring the Houthis, the rebels from the north of Yemen who are allied with the former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, to the negotiating table. My question really is that actually what the desired end game is for Saudi Arabia? After all, on the 5th of April, Houthis indicated their wish to get to the negotiating table after 10 days of bombing. Nothing seems to have come of that. A couple of days ago, we heard about the potential resignation of the United Nations Special Envoy to Yemen. I think that's now happened, just now. So, how is this settlement going to happen? Is there really the machinery in place to bring people to the table? I would suggest that continuing the bombing campaign on Yemen for any longer will set this country back into the dark ages. I don't think it's viable to imagine in a culture where revenge is very deeply rooted, that bombing people into submission will get them to a negotiating table and cowl them into a settlement which puts the same old players back in power.
And it's
just not viable.
And do you think taking action, and especially when it comes to taking action, time is a critical element there?
I do. I think it's incredibly critical. Now, what could that solution possibly look like? That's really difficult. We've had the National Dialogue conference that was run by the UN, which looked, on the surface at least, as though it was going to lead to a successful set of outcomes and perhaps a federal solution to Yemen. The problem, and a problem that we must be very wary of repeating, is trying to dictate an outcome either from the international community or from the old players inside Yemen, and doing that from the center, from either Sana'a, the center of former northern Yemen, or from Aden, the center of former southern Yemen. Regions have to be involved.
When you mention dictating a solution, are you hinting here at the United Nations Security Council? Or?
Well, I think that the United Nations had a vision of what it thought would be a good solution, and I think that the dialogue was rushed into. It may have had 565 delegates from all over Yemen, but how representative were they? How were they chosen? In the eastern region of Yemen, Al-Mahra, where I work, it took about 3 weeks asking around on the ground just for people to be able to find out who was representing them in the dialogue. And as it turned out, all of their representatives were from political parties. And yet at the same time, my own research shows that 65% of people have zero interest in political parties and are not party active in the least. So, you know, I think it's very questionable how in touch with different areas of Yemen the national dialogue actually was. I think that the federal solution that was very nearly tabled this January and which led the Houthis to renew their onslaught this January was flawed. I think the federal regions that were suggested might have looked good on paper and might have seemed like a great idea to the UN, but I don't think regions were properly involved in hashing them out. And we've now seen the upshots of that.
Dr. Elisabeth Kendall, also Senior Research Fellow in Arabic, joined us from Muscat in Oman. Many thanks for sharing your thoughts. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dilly Hussain, the Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran could be seen, what's happening is in Yemen could be seen as the last round in this Cold War, obviously with Lebanon, Bahrain and Syria and Iraq being the previous episodes of that war. Do you agree that this is the last episode?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's last, it's most definitely the latest.
The latest,
yes. And most definitely is. And the reason why Yemen in particular is unique compared to Bahrain or Iraq or Syria or even Lebanon is that Yemen borders Saudi Arabia. And the last thing Saudi Arabia wants is a hostile, pro-Iranian, Shia-led government in the south of its border, which it fears with the rise of the Houthis. And as for the wider Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran, this has basically been the case since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And what we've seen ever since then is proxy wars and proxy battles being fought in numerous areas of the Middle East, where Saudi Arabia and the GCC, backed by the US, and Iran with its what is known as the axis of resistance, backed by Russia. And this is the kind of Cold War that's been playing out. But most definitely Yemen is the most latest battleground in this Cold War.
And with the US being a key player in this, let's see what experts there are saying. We will talk to Nadwa Al-Dawsari, Senior Fellow at the Project on Middle East Democracy, joining us now from Washington, D.C. Welcome to our discussion.
Thank you for hosting me.
Nadwa, the United Nations envoy to Yemen, Jamal bin Omar, resigned today. You tweeted saying it's good news, and perhaps many others perhaps think the same. But why do you think so?
Well, I mean, the UN envoy has been mediating in Yemen for almost 4 years now, and while he has been, I mean, it's undeniable that he has been working with some really difficult actors and in a highly contested political environment. I don't think, and many others also don't think, that he has utilized the role of the UN effectively. It was clear that Saleh and Houthis have been trying to destabilize the country since 2012. The UN Security Council issued several statements, and in some of these statements mentioned Saleh and threatened to take action against those who obstruct the transition in clear reference to Saleh and Houthis. But the UN Security Council failed to take action, and we did with the sanctions back in September. It was too little too late. Houthis and Saleh have already staged a coup and have taken over the government. And I think the UN Security Council did not take action because of the leadership of Jamal bin Omar himself. Now, a lot of people believe that Jamal bin Omar have caved in too much into Houthis' demands. He's clearly not seen among a wide segment of Yemeni leaders and civil society activists as an objective person, or as an effective person rather. So I think at this point, a new person will bring a new perspective and will rebuild legitimacy and trust in the UN role in Yemen.
And if we had to weigh it, how is the persona of any UN envoy detrimental in Yemen's case today, and why?
I think any person who should be involved in Yemen should at least have some good track record and success dealing with similar situations in countries that have similar contexts. I think that's very important.
Mm-hmm. Well, Nadwa Al-Dawsari, leading Yemeni specialist on tribes, tribal conflict resolution systems, and a pioneer in designing and implementing innovative cultural-specific conflict-sensitive programs at the Middle East Institute. Many thanks for talking to us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dilly, in most military conflicts, there is a wider socio-economic, geopolitical, and religious context, you argue, and you say Yemen is no exception. Tell us more about those.
Okay, so like every conflict, whether it be in the West or in the East, it has numerous factors which have to be taken into consideration when one does political analysis. And as I've mentioned in many articles, is that Yemen is no exception to this rule. So politically speaking, we know that we've got Al-Qaeda on the ground. We know we have the Muslim Brotherhood Islah Party on the ground. We have Salafi elements, as well as the Houthis, who are Zaidis, and as well as your average layman Sunni or Shia in Yemen. So there's numerous players on the ground there. We know Ali Abdullah Saleh, who more or less still controls the army, are backing the Houthis. We know that President Hadi and the Saudi-led airstrikes is being supported by the Islah Party, the Muslim Brotherhood. And therefore, what we see is naturally, whatever's happening in Yemen is sort of drawing in outside players. So it's a sort of a playground for the bigger players to sort of flex their muscles. Economically speaking, since its inception, Yemen has been economically weak. Its economic policies have been quite regressive, and that's as a result of basically brutal dictators and tyrants ruling over such a land. And therefore, there are so many numerous factors that have to be taken in. And obviously, there's also the sectarian element of of Yemen. So as I mentioned previously, you've got Al-Qaeda, you've got the Zaidis who are Houthis, Shias, and you've obviously got the Islah Party, who are the Muslim Brotherhood, and they're Sunni. So all of these factors have to be taken in when you're making a political analysis of not only Yemen but every conflict that takes place.
Mm-hmm. And now we are joined by journalist and analyst Peter Salisbury, who until last year was based in Sana'a in Yemen, today talking to us from New York. Welcome to our discussion here in London.
Hi there, thank you for having me.
In a research paper at Chatham House, you argued that primary drivers of tension and conflict in Yemen are local, but the perceived and often exaggerated roles of external players continue to affect the calculations of the Yemeni players and of different regional actors. Tell us more about those vis-à-vis what is happening in Yemen today.
Sure, so the argument that we make in the paper is that internal conflicts within Yemen are largely to do with different groups trying to achieve dominance, trying to achieve control of the state, of the economy in Yemen's resources. And generally, these groups aren't motivated by sectarian ideology or by any ideology at all, really, beyond standard definitions of their identity and who's around them, who will group with them, who will work on their side. And the issue in Yemen is, if you look at Saudi Arabia's intervention in Yemen today, in the 1960s, the Saudis backed a royalist faction in northern Yemen's civil war. Now, the royalists were Zaydis. They were from this offshoot of Shia Islam that the Houthis are from. And at the same time, Egypt was backing Arab Republicans. If you fast forward into the 80s, the Saudis were then backing the Arab Republicans because they were worried about a socialist state in the south of Yemen. But then in the mid-90s, the Saudis were backing effectively the socialists who had united, become one country with the north, then decided they didn't want to be, and had decided to back out. That sparked another civil war, but the Saudis were angry with the regime in Sana'a because they had backed Saddam Hussein in his invasion of Kuwait, and so on and so forth until today, where we see the Houthis working with Ali Abdullah Saleh, with this guy who fought 6 wars against them within 6 years between 2004 and 2010, supposedly backed by Iran, and the Iranians by this point are certainly backing them, but as we argue in the paper, their past support for the Houthis has been fairly limited and probably grossly exaggerated, but over time the Houthis have been left with very little choice but to look for an external backer. Saleh has, over his time, over 33 years in charge of first the North and then the United Yemen, would work with pretty much anyone, on one day with the Americans, the next with the Russians, the next with the Iranians, the next with the Saudis. So people within Yemen are pretty pragmatic in terms of who they will work with. The problem that we're seeing right now is this sense on the Saudis' part that they need to impose their dominance on the region. They need to show that they're the dominant force, and they need to show the Iranians what's what. And what we're seeing is, because of that, this sectarian narrative, which, as your previous guest said, is pretty flawed, becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the problem at the moment is that the Saudis are claiming that their issue isn't a sectarian one, and it's quite right to say that their issue is really just to do with a regional rivalry with Iran, but at the same time they have to kind of play up the Sunni side of things. So they're working with the Sunni Islamist party, and they're looking at other Sunni kind of states in the region. And then if you look at sort of the media within Saudi Arabia, you look at what's happening in terms of top clerics within the country and what they're saying, they're definitely playing up the sectarian and the Iran side of things. But this is just yet another case of international interests colliding within Yemen, and the Yemenis paying the cost.
Mm-hmm. And while Saudi Arabia perceives the Houthis as an Iranian proxy, you argue the group has some support from Iran, but it is not the same as taking orders from Iran. Tell us more about this.
Yes, absolutely. So during the writing of that paper, I sat down and I spoke to a lot of people. We're talking diplomats, people who work on the security side of things. And I looked through all the publicly available information that I could get. And what surprised me was that despite the increasingly strong assertions from the United States, from the Saudis, and from various administrations in Sana'a that the Houthis are backed by Iran, they are in fact a proxy, is that the evidence they've gathered and made available in public is pretty slim. And when we look at the diplomatic cables leaked by WikiLeaks several years ago, and we look to the 2009 episode of the civil war with the Houthis fighting then against the Saleh regime, and the Saleh regime being backed by Saudi Arabia, which was launching airstrikes in the north of Yemen against the Houthis, what we see is Saleh speaking to the Americans and saying, I am helping you fight Iran, and the Americans expressing doubt that the Iranians were really that heavily involved with the Houthis, and in fact being worried that he was diverting resources that they'd provided to fight Al-Qaeda in Yemen away from the fight with Al-Qaeda to serve his own personal interests, to shore up his own power within the country. So the evidence pre-2011, 2012, that Iran was this backer for the Houthis and was in some way using them as a puppet is pretty slim. And what we've seen since 2012, I've been told, is the Iranians on a number of occasions stepping in, speaking to the Houthis and saying, maybe you want to move a little slower, maybe you want to do X, Y, and Z. So, for example, after they took the capital city, after they took Sana'a, what I was told was that where there was Iranian advice to the Houthis, it was, why not play the political game? Why not play the long game here? But what we've seen is the Houthis going absolutely on a rampage, trying to take over most of the center of the country, the western seaboard, and now the south of the country. And I think the problem is, and this is a problem the Saudis will soon encounter as they try and build a coalition in the country, and as we've seen in Syria, as we've seen in Iraq, and as we've seen in Libya and Lebanon over the past decade and decades before them, is you can fund and arm groups and you can work alongside them, but that's just not the same thing as being able to press a button and tell them what to do.
And Peter, how would you look at the United Nations Security Council resolution on Yemen calling Houthis to withdraw?
Well, that's been the position of the Security Council for a number of months now. Basically, since the Houthis entered Amran, a province in the north of Yemen, they've been calling for the Houthis to withdraw and disarm. That's been their position consistently as the Houthis have spread across the country. That resolution was maybe more interesting for the fact that, in effect, it was sponsored by Saudi Arabia, that the Saudis held the pen, as people say in the UN, that they wrote most of the resolution, and that the language within it was what the Saudis wanted, and that one of the reasons that we saw only one abstention, one country, which was Russia, sitting aside, was because they were unhappy because they couldn't get language on humanitarian aid in there. But I think the resolution is less notable for calling for the Houthis to withdraw. That's been the position of the UN for a long time, and more interesting because we're seeing, again, the Saudis playing a much more aggressive role in the way that they approach their international role. King Abdullah was very much someone who liked to be behind the scenes, to negotiate behind closed doors, whereas Salman, the new king, has obviously decided to take a much more aggressive and open approach to the way that he pursues his agenda within the region and his approach to international relations.
Peter Salisbury, former project consultant at Chatham House, with works published in The Economist, The Financial Times, and Foreign Policy, and others. Thank you very much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Dilly, when it comes to recent developments, and obviously what Peter just spoke about, the role of the new ruler of Saudi Arabia, King Salman, to reorganize the political order in the region, what do you have to say about this role?
Well, obviously, there is a stark difference to how King Salman is exercising his rule compared to his predecessor. So what we see is he's reaching out to the Muslim Brotherhood who, historically speaking, have had a hot and cold relationship with the Saudi regime. He's reached out to President Erdogan of Turkey, of Sisi in Egypt, Morocco, Sudan, and even Pakistan. So what we're seeing now is a sort of military coalition like one we've not necessarily seen since the Arab-Israeli wars of the late 60s and early 70s. And so it's going to be very interesting. But what we have to also appreciate as well is why King Salman is taking such an aggressive approach. And the reason why I think this is, and it's very clear, is that Iran has now reached a deal with the West regarding its nuclear enrichment program, and sanctions will gradually be lifted from Iran. So there will be a stronger Iran in the region. Furthermore, if the Houthis take Bab al-Mandeb, one of the main biggest oil thoroughfares, then you'll see the GCC states will be strangled. The Straits of Hormuz is ruled by, policed by Iran. Bab al-Mandeb, if it's taken by the Houthis, it will basically strangle the GCC states in how the oil gets through and past that area. So there's numerous factors behind why King Salman is taking such an aggressive approach, but then this goes back to the geopolitical Cold War that's taking place between Iran and Saudi.
And now let's talk to Yemen expert Ibrahim Al-Qataby, joining us from New York. Welcome to our discussion.
Thanks for having me.
Mr. Al-Qataby, what needs to be done on the ground in Yemen, do you think?
I think right now there needs to be a movement on the ground alongside the political movement that has taken place regionally and internationally, by the Gulf countries, but also by the UN Security Council. There needs to be a movement to remove those officials who were appointed by the Houthis, mainly in different states like Ta'az, Ib, and elsewhere, and also to stop the Saleh's militias on the ground and the Houthi militias. If people have family members in the army, they should call them to come home. This is a waste of Yemeni blood. This war, it's not going to give Saleh or Houthis any gain of power. So I think a lot of things need to happen. I think one of them, it's clear that the international community and the Gulf countries stand clearly and strongly with Yemen. What we need now on the ground is that One, there is a great step that took place a few days ago when President Hadi appointed the Prime Minister Khalid Bahah to be his, vice president. I think that's a very good step. In the past, we've seen the presidency of the president's office was so weak, and it was divided between different groups. As you know, President Hadi had many advisors from different political groups, which I think was not the right thing to do. So I think we need a strong, the president's office needs to be hiring more qualified people in terms of the advisors, and in terms of hiring media folks who could do a very good job in addressing the concerns of Yemenis, but also direct Yemenis what to do and how to do it. So I think, like I said, I think the movement has to grow stronger on the ground. As you know, what the Yemenis are facing right now is just a militia that causing just killing people left and right, and causing a lot of destructions across the country. And it's very hard to basically to go against because the vast majority of Yemenis have spoken since 2011, since the uprising, that they want peace and not war. But the Saleh and the Houthi militias keep just using weapons and violence to gain power. I don't think that's going to work in Yemen, and I think we can see an end to their sort of movement soon. So that's what needs to be done right now. People need to come together. Political movements of the political parties need to come out as strongly advising the people what to do. I think that President Hadi with the Prime Minister and his new Vice President Khalid Bahah need to be put a strong team together. But also, I think what we need to do, what the Gulf countries led by Saudi need to do, is to send humanitarian aid to Yemen. They need to act quickly. They need to put a Marshall Plan together as soon as possible to basically, I think one of the main issues in Yemen is not only that we see in militias causing problems, but I think the main issue that led to almost everything we see today is the lack of accountability. And I think that's the main issue. But also, there is no development. There is no plan to move Yemen forward in terms of sustainable development, all kind of developments, but also accountability and the rule of law. So I think once we see one corrupt officials or a criminal like Saleh be held accountable, once we see some sort of building of new institutions, strong institutions, accountable institutions, once we see some roads are being built, schools, creating jobs for youth, I think that's when we going to see the country moving forward. As you know, Al-Qaeda and Al-Houthi alike, they only expand when there is no government institution. They only expand when the government is weakened. They only expand when there is no jobs and there is no sort of development. So that's how they recruit the youth, just because the youth have no jobs. So the only thing to do to gain an income is to join a militia. So I think
Dilly Hussain here at the studio doesn't seem to agree very well, so let's give him some time.
I mean, I don't entirely disagree what Ibrahim Qataby said, but there's some points that I obviously need to highlight. I mean, it's all good and well trying to shift the blame entirely on the Houthis, and that will be a gross mistake. And the reason why that is because it's President Hadi that went around the Arab world begging other states to basically bomb the Houthis. And we all know very well with airstrikes of such nature, it's not just going to be Houthis' lives that are going to be taken, it's going to be the lives of innocent Yemenis. So I think from my perspective...
Look, sir, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think you blaming the victim here. President Hadi did not do anything wrong. He kept it peaceful until the guy was put under house arrest. The entire government was put under house arrest by the
Look,
Houthi militia.
look.
I'm not saying to blame the Houthi or the Al-Qaeda for the mistakes that were done in Yemen. What I was saying is that they only expand and grow when there is weak institutions,
And there's
when there is no
a weak
jobs.
government, and a weak government, and ultimately that's been the case with Yemen for decades now.
But that's not an excuse for
No,
a
but
militia.
it's not an excuse
or for
based on reality. I know it's not an excuse based on reality, and the reality is that groups such as militias, such as Houthis or Al-Qaeda or any militia groups, they thrive and they expand from weak government, a lack of accountability, which you stated. So maybe we need to address the wider problem, not just within Yemen, which is reoccurring in the region as a whole, and that's the governments which have a lack of accountability, who are not fair upon their own people. There's not a level of justice when it comes to redistributing wealth and employment and so forth. And the reason why that is, and ultimately this is what it is, the rulers that rule over the Muslim world and the Arab world, they are all stooges of some sense or not of Western external powers. So if this is not addressed, then we are going to have the growth and the expansion of Houthis, of Al-Qaeda, and unless we address those major issues, which you did clearly state, and rightfully so, is that Yemen, along with other Arab and Muslim countries, we need accountable governments. We need governments that actually care about their own people. Because when these kind of important, basic necessities are not fulfilled, then of course the youth will go and seek this from other entities and other powers. So that's the reality. I mean, we can sit here and blame militias and terrorist organizations in not just Yemen, in many countries. But the reality is that the reason why they exist in the first place is usually because of foreign meddling, the lack of accountability and oppression and injustice imposed by their own governments, and therefore they seek assurance and belonging elsewhere. Would you agree with me there?
Look, I agree the lack of accountability is one of the major issues in the Arab world and maybe around the country as well, around the world. I think the lack of accountability, like I said, is when we let Saleh, like criminals like Saleh and the Houthi, to basically walk around killing people and damaging the outcome of the national dialogue. So here is the other thing. We can't just blame foreign intervention for our problems. We can't just say that they doing this and doing that.
So do you support the Saudi-led airstrikes then in your country?
Look, I'll tell you this. I don't support any military intervention because military intervention never solve a problem and never bring stability. Okay. That's one thing to do. But here is what we need to think about too. Who is going to protect the civilians in Aden and in Al-Dawsari and elsewhere that are being Houthi and Salih militia killed way far more than anyone can do in Yemen. Thousands of people. You know, since the Salih, for example, when he took over power, that was when he assassinated the former president Ibrahim Hadi, the one who had a real plan to move Yemen forward, and Yemen seen the greatest days in his 30 years of ruling the country. After that, he declared a war in 1994 against people in the south, and since then he declared, actually funded tribes across the Yemen. So let me finish my point.
Yes.
So this is not an intervention that came from outside. This is a homemade killing. So we can't best blame the West, and we can't just blame Saudi. Saudi, I think, in my opinion, they had no choice. I don't think they wanted to go to military in Yemen, but they had no choice.
What is the way out of it, Mr.
I mean, it's
Qataby?
clear. Look, the way out of it is clear. We have a national dialogue. We had a great outcome of national dialogue. Almost everyone, including Al-Houthi and Salih's group, were part of it. All of them were working so hard to show that they can bring something good to the Yemeni people. And they all presented well at the national dialogue. They all come with great resolutions. They all came with great list of what needs to be done to build a strong state, to build a new Yemen, to build a system that is accountable, that everyone have equal access to it, that address all the concerns and the grievances that we had in the past. But who won against that outcome of national dialogue? That's not Saudi, that's not the Gulf countries, that's not the US, that's not the UK. That's the Houthis and Saleh thought they were going to lose power in the country. They turned the table and used violence.
The Houthis never really had power in Yemen.
Yeah, of course. I mean, they
The
didn't
Houthis
have
never really had power. Look, I'm not here to justify. Look, I think Mr. Qataby.
No. But just to say, look,
I'm not here to justify the action of the Houthis. What I'm saying is every party involved is guilty of some kind of injustice and crimes. What I'm saying is that there are more nuances to this conflict, just like any other conflict. And if we're going to totally rule out the meddling behind the scenes by US and other security services of other countries in the case of Yemen, then that's really naive. We know from WikiLeaks and we know from CIA reports that, you know, ever since the ousting of Ali Abdullah Saleh and Hadi coming in, that there were long discussions taking place with the Obama administration, with Saudi, with other GCC states, in how they were going to basically put the Houthis and keep them at arm's length. But what I'm trying to say here, Mr. Qataby, is this. The Yemenis, at the moment, right, you can't say on one hand what the Saudis, they had no choice. You can't say the Saudis were left with no choice but for military intervention, then after they've bombed Yemen to then send humanitarian aid. That just doesn't make sense.
Look, here is the point. Houthis would completely threaten a country. I mean, every country has a national security concerns, and if any country's existence is at stake, people will take actions. I'm not justifying any actions. I'm against military actions, but the Houthis, actually, the one that led everyone to Saleh has the military, led everyone to this chaotic situation.
Mr. Ibrahim Al-Qataby, former lead advisor on UN Secretary General's high-level panel on post-2015 development, joins us from New York City. Thank you very much for taking part.
Thanks.
Thank you. And Dilly, while it's no secret that Iran implemented a similar strategy in Yemen by arming the Houthis, how is this imminent nuclear deal with Iran, or the framework deal basically for now, how is it going to affect this support, in your opinion, to the Houthi rebels?
Okay. So as you've seen, that Iran has relatively taken a back seat so far. And the reason why that is because they didn't necessarily want to ruin the ongoing discussions regarding reaching a nuclear deal and getting the sanctions lifted, which was eventually successful in Lausanne 2 weeks ago. But again, this goes back to what I said to you earlier in the show, and that is that Saudi Arabia, along with the GCC, now that they know that Iran's nuclear enrichment program will steadily continue and the sanctions will be eventually lifted, they're looking at a far stronger Iran in the region, and they need to counter that. But the irony of this is the US is fighting alongside Iran against ISIS in Iraq. The US, along with other Arab states, are bombing ISIS, allegedly, in Raqqa, as well as other Syrian rebel factions. So what we're seeing here is that the US is playing two double games. In one hand, they're with Iran, they're fighting alongside Iran in Iraq, they're indirectly supporting the Assad regime by bombing Syrian rebels, but in Yemen, the US has shown unequivocal support for the Saudi-led airstrikes. So as I said to your guest, Ibrahim Qataby, is that we can't just look at Yemen as an isolated case. This is a disease, a problem which is reoccurring in the region as a whole. And to rule out foreign intervention and foreign meddling, it would be very naive and would be a mistake. Because at the end of the day, if we go back decades upon decades upon decades, how do we reach this situation? We reached this situation post-World War I. We reached a situation from the meddling of foreign states during the Cold War. So these are the kind of historical factors. And we're not talking about looking back too long ago in history. And if we don't understand the historical factors which have led to the current situation, then we can never think about viable solutions for the future.
So not even in the near future, a temporary solution? A
temporary solution would be that the Saudi-led airstrikes need to stop. And similarly, the Houthis need to be somehow, kept at bay.
But that's Iran keeping them at bay.
No. Iran would. I'm very sure that Iran would like to see a strong Houthi control over Yemen, whether it's a long game or a very aggressive approach as they're doing now. But what we need to realize is that whoever intervenes, not just in Yemen, and as you will see throughout the whole show, I've tried not to just focus on Yemen, is that this pattern is happening everywhere in the Arab world. Foreign countries need to stop intervening in other countries' affairs based on their own selfish harm and benefit interests. If they're going to intervene, then do so for sincerely doing it for the help of the Muslims of that country, not because it fits their geopolitical interest. Because then that kind of intervention is limited, it's flawed, and it's short-lived.
And now we are joined by Yemen specialist Fernando Carvajal, talking to us from Los Angeles, California. Welcome to Straightforward.
Thank you for having me.
Fernando, dialogue is the only solution and the only way to ensure delivery of much needed humanitarian aid. In the case of Oman's mediator initiative, how realistic do you think it is to achieve a roundtable dialogue with all parties involved?
I think at the moment, dialogue seems, as you mentioned, the only way out. How realistic would Oman's offer, would Oman's overture be? In my opinion, is the only realistic option. It is the only practical option for all parties to sit at the table and negotiate not only a ceasefire, but also a return to the political transition process.
Yes, and you argue that the coalition led by Saudi Arabia faces mounting challenges. Tell us more about those challenges.
Well, if we look at the press conference from the Saudi ambassador in Washington yesterday, it's been argued over the last 3 weeks. Now we're into the 4th week of Operation Decisive Storm. The coalition insists that they've degraded the Houthi military capabilities. They've insisted that the forces loyal to former President Ali Abdullah Saleh are degraded and on the run. But yet, as of yesterday, we see media reports that Houthis are advancing into the oil-rich province of Ma'rib, that they remain around the province of Aden, besieging the port city. And also this morning, we hear of new clashes in the central city of Taiz. So then one wonders what military capabilities have been targeted. We know that the Air Force, the Yemeni Air Force, has been destroyed. There is total air superiority by the coalition. But on the ground, Houthi militia and military units loyal to former President Ali Abdullah Saleh continue to move. And the armed clashes continue to escalate around the country.
Fernando Carvajal, PhD candidate in Arab Islamic Studies at Exeter University in England, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Elisabeth, head of the Doctors Without Borders mission in Yemen, warned about the deteriorating situation in Sana'a, where even though they have been able to get medical supplies this weekend, there is concern about getting food, water, fuel and medication for chronic illnesses if the conflict continues. We do hope parties involved multiply efforts to achieve a resolution in Yemen soon. And as this episode comes to an end, I'd like to thank our guests who joined us today, Dr. Elisabeth Kendall of the University of Oxford, Nadwa Al-Dawsari, Senior Fellow Project on Middle East Democracy in Washington, D.C. Joined us also from California was Fernando Carvajal of Exeter University, and Peter Salisbury, journalist, political analyst, and Ibrahim Al-Qataby, Yemen expert and analyst, joined us from New York City. And of course, our studio guest here, Dilly Hussain, deputy editor of UK-based 5 Pillars. I'd like to thank you again for being with us. And I'd like to thank you for watching Straightforward today with me, Karl Al-Khawairi. Stay tuned to Levant TV, and I'll be with you again soon, and bye for now.